Uh, thanks for sticking out to the end, to the audience and to the panelists for pretty much laying the groundwork on what happened in these elections. The main point to take away is that there was an unprecedentedly large share of the vote that went for pro-Western parties. And it's not just that the Communist Party is no longer in, but that the share that went to pro-Western parties is higher than it's ever been. And people have made many comparisons with 2004, that sort of the big distinction between this one and the changes that took place 2 years ago is the complete consolidation of pro-Western groups in power, both in the presidency and the parliament. The reading of this has typically been that there's been a shift in attitudes in the Ukrainian electorate, that Ukraine itself has moved to the West. That because of Russian aggression, there's been greater Ukrainian unity. They've turned away from the East. And that essentially the activity that's taking place is you're just getting a bigger pool of pro-Western voters. I think there's reason to question this. So the part of that argument is that essentially the change in share is an increase in the numerator, if we think of the share of the vote of pro-Western parties as a fraction. But if you look at the electoral trends in Ukraine over the last decade, most of the activity is not in the numerator. In other words, the number of Ukrainians voting for pro-Western parties. Most of the activity is in the denominator. In other words, the number of Ukrainians who are voting at all. And so there's a risk, I think, in looking at the share of the vote, to miss something fundamental which seems to be taking place, particularly after the changes that took place this year, which is the exit of a large number of people from the polity in Ukraine. Not just because of Russian aggression, but also people are opting out. And it's not a random selection of people that are opting out. It's people of a particular political bent and a particular regional location that are opting out. And I think that's a real danger for the future of Ukrainian sovereignty. So let's just walk through the data for a little bit. If you look so I've done a crude calculation of pro-Western votes, which includes parties like Lyashko, which, pro-Western or not, he's anti-Russian at the very least. So we'll throw him in the pro-Western camp. If you look at 2004, this is the third round of the presidential elections. You had 15.1 million votes for Yushchenko, right? That's the high watermark in the Ukrainian post-independence period. If you look, moving forward to 2014, the presidential elections are relatively close. You tend to have a higher turnout in the presidential elections. But as Tim pointed out, it's not clear that people were voting for Poroshenko because he was pro-Western. Many people were voting for Poroshenko simply because he was the candidate of greater stability. So I think there's something to think about in those data. But again, it's pretty constant. In other words, if we compare the current parliamentary elections to the 2012 parliamentary elections, it's a difference of approximately 1 million voters voting for pro-Western parties. But, in these parliamentary elections, the president was pro-Western and the prime minister and the government were pro-Western. And we know enough about Ukrainian elections to know that that helps. Right? So I'm not saying that there was 1 million votes bought or administrative resources secured 1 million votes, but we do have the sense that there's a strong incumbency advantage in Ukrainian elections. So again, the numerator is pretty constant over time. If you look at the denominator, in other words, the number of ballots that were cast, the number of people that voted, it's almost cut in half between 2004 and 2014. That's a huge drop. In other words, approximately 13 million voters have left the electorate. Now, some of those have left the electorate because they've left the country, right? So that's certainly a big part of the shift that takes place between 2012 and 2014. But it's also just the case that an increasing number of Ukrainians are not that invested in Ukrainian politics. They're opting out. And in particular, I think we can read the changes that take place between 2012 and 2014, in particular between the presidential elections and the parliamentary elections, as an increasing number of voters not wanting to engage with the Ukrainian polity and potentially turning away from the concept of Ukraine. And that's particularly true when we look at where these voters come from. So Obviously there's the tremendous, sort of a 5 million voter cut in the loss of Crimea and the parts of the Donbass where the elections didn't take place. But this is, the parts of Donetsk and Luhansk where the elections took place, you also have a significant decline in turnout. And this table shows everything that was more than a 5% drop from 2012 to 2014. And so there's a very specific character to the regions where you have the loss of voters between 2012 and 2014. Donetsk, Luhansk, Chernihiv Oblast, Odessa, Kherson, Mykolaiv, Zaporozhye, Kharkiv, Zakarpatska, and Dnipropetrovsk down there. This is what some people call Novorossiya, right? This is a source of concern, right? There's a particular pro-Russian leaning in a lot of the electorate in these areas, and the fact that they are choosing not to vote at all is a sign that they're opting out of the polity. And something very much that we should not be excited about, I think. There's a lot of euphoria about the pro-Western turn and this focus on the aggregate vote share. But I think if we look at what's driving that aggregate vote share, it's not an increase in the number of pro-Western Ukrainians. It's a decrease in the number of non-pro-Western Ukrainians who are invested in Ukraine and who are taking part in these elections. And so there's a systematic shift in who's voting, and it's biasing the Ukrainian electorate in favor of pro-Western parties, but it's also leading to the disenfranchisement of a significant part of the electorate that used to hold power. And I think that is something, again, to watch. Why is this dangerous? I think since the Maidan, there has been the problem of the South and East. Right? I agree with Oksana that we shouldn't lump them all together precisely, and we should look oblast by oblast. But there's still something distinctive about the oblasts of the South and East that is worth paying attention to. They have been historically more pro-Russian. They were, on the whole, not in favor of the Maidan when it was going on. They were not in favor of the government that took power after the Maidan. And so there is a problem of how one incorporates these large swaths of the country. We've seen a failure to incorporate Crimea, not just because of Russian aggression. I mean, the military defected in those cases. I'm not saying that the referendum was legitimate, but there certainly was popular sentiment not to be part of Ukraine after the changes in power that took place in Kiev. You have similar problems in parts of the Donbass. Looking at the survey data on Kharkiv, it looks a lot like the Donbass in a lot of ways. So I think there's a risk of losing these areas over time. And this was in a period of relatively less hardship than what we're going to see going forward. So we're about to see an increase in domestic gas prices. We're about to see a deepening of the economic crisis. And so if these regions aren't invested in Kiev now, and if they're not invested in Ukraine now, and they don't feel that they're represented in this parliament or by this president, I think it's going to be a very dangerous set of months going forward. Okay, thanks very much.